In January 2025, the cold fluorescent lights enveloped the Arizona Police Department's records storage warehouse, where thousands of old document boxes were stacked in silence. An investigator flipped open a faded cardboard box, its exterior bearing the faint label, Hartwell, Elaine Calder, Ruth, 1959. Central, we need to unseal this box and transfer the evidence to forensics. His voice echoed in the sealed room, accompanied only by the rustle of papers and the hum of an old air conditioner. What began as a routine review of cold cases was now turning into something entirely different, something that could answer questions that had haunted Arizona for over 6 decades. Inside the box were small personal items, seized in the summer of 1959, when Elaine Hartwell, 18, and Ruth Calder, 20, disappeared after an evening gathering. The two young women left a familiar place and never returned home. For more than half a century, the disappearance of Elaine and Ruth was a wound their families had to accept, while the community gradually learned to forget. Local newspapers at the time called it Arizona's unsolved disappearance from the late 1950s. The initial search lasted weeks, extending across roads, neighborhoods, and desert areas, but yielded only scattered clues and conflicting theories. As the investigation cooled, the case was closed with a familiar note: missing, cause undetermined. Over time, witnesses aged, memories faded, and the case was buried in storage. But more than 60 years later, from those seemingly meaningless pieces of evidence, the past began to resurface. As modern techniques were applied to the 1959 samples, old assumptions began to crumble. Reopening the Elaine Hartwell and Ruth Calder files was not just a belated effort. It was the first domino in a chain of truths, hidden for decades, about the disappearance, about investigative errors, and about the question that justice had never abandoned. This is not just the story of two girls who didn't come home. It is the story of time, perseverance, and how the truth, even buried for over half a century, still finds its way back to the light. Before diving deeper into the story, please leave a comment and let us know where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. If you enjoy true crime stories like this, please like the video, subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, and share it with someone you think would like it too. In the summer of 1959, Arizona was immersed in the dry, scorching desert heat, with suburban roads still bathed in the yellow glow of streetlights, casting over what seemed like an ordinary evening's quiet life. In that setting, Elaine Hartwell, 18, and Ruth Calder, 20, left a familiar gathering as night began to fall, carrying a mild fatigue after a long day, but showing no signs of distress or tension. Both were known for their clear daily routines, rarely changing plans abruptly, and leaving the gathering at that time was entirely consistent with their usual schedule. The starting point was a familiar social area they had visited many times before, and from there, the expected route was a short, common path connecting the gathering spot to the residential areas where Elaine and Ruth lived. It was a route that was not unfamiliar, considered safe by the standards of the time, frequently traveled by others, and not viewed as a place with any particular risks, especially in the early evening. According to information confirmed later, Elaine and Ruth left within a relatively clear time frame, when street lights were still on, surrounding activity had not yet thinned out, and nothing stood out to make witnesses remember or suspect anything unusual. The last time the two girls were seen was as they left the gathering area, heading in the direction consistent with their planned route, showing no signs of panic, no indications of being followed or coerced, and no unusual incidents recorded at that moment. After that point, all traces of Elaine Hartwell and Ruth Calder seemed to vanish completely. No further confirmed sightings, no calls, no messages to family or friends, and no evidence that they reached any intended stops along the route. As time passed and the night grew quieter, the fact that Elaine and Ruth did not return home began to cause clear concern, since both had the habit of notifying others if they were running late or changing plans, especially on days without special events. Elaine's family were the first to notice the unusual prolonged silence, as the expected return time passed without any sign that she had arrived home or stopped at another familiar place. A similar situation unfolded at Ruth's family home, where initial attempts to contact her were made cautiously, from checking with close friends to scanning places Ruth frequently visited, but all yielded no results. As the night turned late, concern gradually turned to panic, because both disappearing at the same time, without contact and without any clear reason for absence, exceeded ordinary explanations. Initial assumptions like staying over at a friend's or encountering a minor issue on the road became less convincing as time continued without any information, especially since Elaine and Ruth were not carrying items needed for an overnight stay and had no history of voluntarily disappearing. Both families conducted personal searches within familiar areas, checking expected routes and regular hangouts, but no one had seen Elaine or Ruth after they left the gathering, nor were there signs they had intentionally altered their travel plans. As dawn approached, the prolonged silence could no longer be ignored, and the lack of clues from spontaneous efforts forced the families to confront the possibility that the situation had gone beyond a simple delay. After discussion and consideration, the families of Elaine Hartwell and Ruth Calder made the official decision to report the girls' disappearance to the police, providing basic details about the time they left the gathering, the expected route, and the absence of any signs of voluntary departure, marking the moment the incident was formally recorded as a missing persons case, with the end of the initial phase being the complete disappearance, without explanation, without clear traces, and without any clues about what happened after Elaine and Ruth left on that summer night in 1959. Immediately after the families of Elaine Hartwell and Ruth Calder officially reported the incident, the information about the two girls not returning home throughout the night was received as a missing persons case, requiring documentation and processing according to procedure, with the first step being the creation of an official file to systematize initial data before any further actions were taken. The report was handled in a context where enough time had passed to rule out ordinary delays, while the simultaneous disappearance of both, lack of contact, and absence of signs of voluntary absence, led to the case being taken seriously from the start. The missing persons file was opened under the names Elaine Hartwell, 18, and Ruth Calder, 20, including basic identification details, residential addresses, family circumstances, and necessary personal data for the initial assessment. The focus of this phase was not on pursuing traces or conducting external activities, but on gathering and organizing foundational information to best understand the victim's lifestyle context prior to the disappearance. Families and close associates were asked to provide details about Elaine and Ruth's daily habits, including schedules, frequently used routes, familiar locations, and any recent changes, if any, in routine or behavior. This information was recorded carefully, not to immediately seek an explanation, but to build a complete picture of the two girls' everyday lives, thereby determining whether the disappearance deviated from familiar patterns. Personal relationships were also examined within the scope of initial information gathering, including family, friends, colleagues, or anyone Elaine and Ruth regularly interacted with, to determine if any connection could explain both failing to return without notice. This was done through data recording, without making judgments or conclusions, to avoid imposing theories without sufficient background information. Concurrently with collecting personal and relationship data, a final confirmed timeline was established based on what had been verified with certainty, including the time Elaine and Ruth left the gathering and the window when they were last seen in a normal state. Establishing this timeline played a key role in the missing persons file, as it marked the boundary between verifiable information and the unexplained gap, while providing a basis for all subsequent evaluations of the case's progression. The time period from the last confirmed point to when families reported to police was documented in detail, not only to determine the length of absence, but also to assess the degree of abnormality compared to the victim's routines. Based on this initial data, the case was classified as a suspicious disappearance, not due to specific signs of crime, but because of combined factors including the victims' ages, simultaneous disappearance, prolonged silence, and lack of any indication of voluntary departure. This classification was administrative and directional, ensuring the file was handled with appropriate priority, without implying any conclusions about cause or nature. Within the file's framework, initial hypotheses were cautiously outlined, including the possibility of an unexpected incident on the road, voluntarily changing plans without notice, or involvement of an undetermined external factor, but all were noted as preliminary considerations, with no hypothesis prioritized without supporting data. The goal of this phase was to build a solid information foundation clear enough to distinguish between ordinary possibilities and signs requiring special attention, while avoiding overlooking key details from the outset. The missing persons file for Elaine Hartwell and Ruth Calder was thus formed as a systematic collection of known data, gaps needing clarification, and unanswered questions, with clear boundaries between confirmed information and what could not yet be verified. Throughout the file opening process, no field searches or evidence processing were conducted, as the focus was on ensuring all foundational information was gathered, organized, and evaluated consistently, avoiding hasty actions without full context understanding. This caution reflected a procedural approach, where correctly understanding the issue was seen as an indispensable step before any specific actions, and also marked the transition of the incident from a family concern to an official missing persons file, with structure, classification, and initial direction clearly established from the very first steps. From the systematized information foundation in the missing persons file, field search activities were deployed with the sole goal of determining whether Elaine Hartwell and Ruth Calder had left any physical traces since leaving the gathering, while verifying initial assumptions about their expected travel route. Search areas were established based on confirmed data, including the starting point, geographic distances to residential areas, and routes Elaine and Ruth were highly likely to have chosen based on daily habits, thereby forming a clearly bounded but sufficiently broad search perimeter, covering the most reasonable possibilities. This area was not rigidly defined, but divided into prioritized segments, with main routes searched first, followed by secondary routes, and less used turnoffs, still within normal travel range, ensuring no section was overlooked simply for being less prominent. Roadway searches focused on inspecting pavement, shoulders, and natural stopping points where pedestrians or vehicles might pause briefly, assuming that if Elaine and Ruth encountered an unexpected incident, signs of interruption might appear at one of these locations. Concurrently with roadways, residential areas along the expected route were included in the search, not only to check public spaces, but also to determine if anyone in the area had seen the two girls during the relevant time, thereby supplementing or confirming the last recorded timeline in the file. These residential areas were searched systematically, focusing on open spaces, common pathways, and intersections where Elaine and Ruth's presence, if any, might have been noticed by passers-by or locals. Additionally, remote areas, vacant lots, and less trafficked zones, still within reasonable route range were considered, not because specific signs pointed there, but because eliminating possibilities is an essential part of the search process, especially in a disappearance, leaving no clear traces. During deployment, potential witnesses in the search area were approached and interviewed to gather any direct observations related to seeing Elaine and Ruth after leaving the gathering, as well as any details that could help determine if their journey was interrupted at a specific point. These interviews were conducted within a tight time frame, focusing on what witnesses could recall with certainty, rather than speculation, to avoid distorted or time-affected inaccurate memories. Each account was recorded as independent data, then cross-referenced with other file information for consistency, but no testimony was clear enough to open a new search direction or confirm Elaine and Ruth's presence after the established timeline. The lack of confirming witness information, combined with no physical traces found on searched routes and areas, caused the search process to gradually reach an impasse, where all efforts led to the same conclusion: the complete absence of any indicators explaining the girl's disappearance. In that context, search activities continued within the defined perimeter, but focus gradually shifted from expanding space to re-evaluating the effectiveness of already checked areas, ensuring no details were missed due to subjectivity or unfavorable initial observation conditions. This re-evaluation led to the decision to narrow the search perimeter, not as a retreat, but as a necessary adjustment to concentrate resources on areas still potentially yielding new information, based on what had been systematically eliminated. Narrowing the perimeter meant certain areas were deemed unrelated to Elaine and Ruth's disappearance, at least within existing data, thereby clarifying boundaries between verified possibilities and remaining gaps. The field search deployment phase thus concluded not with a specific discovery, but with a set of exclusionary conclusions, confirming that on the expected travel route, and within reasonable search range, no clear traces indicated Elaine Hartwell and Ruth Calder had stopped, encountered an incident, or left any physical signs after disappearing, thereby laying the groundwork for re-evaluating initial assumptions in subsequent case handling steps, while emphasizing that the very absence of traces had become an important factor to consider in the overall progression of this missing persons case. From the fact that the field searches along the planned route yielded no direct traces whatsoever, attention began to shift towards scattered discoveries that initially seemed unrelated, but gradually formed the first foothold for reshaping the narrative of the disappearance. The discovery of personal belongings belonging to Elaine Hartwell and Ruth Calder did not occur simultaneously or at a single location, but emerged as separate pieces recorded under different circumstances, as areas surrounding the initial search perimeter continued to be swept with greater intensity. Each item identified as belonging to the two victims was treated as an independent unit of information, with the focus placed on confirming ownership, accurately describing identifying characteristics, and ruling out the possibility of confusion with items belonging to others. When the first pieces of evidence were recorded, their discovery locations were carefully measured and documented, not only geographically, but also in relation to the planned route of travel, to determine whether they fell within a reasonable range of the journey. The condition of these items was examined in detail, including their degree of intactness, signs of use, and the presence or absence of factors that might suggest how they had left the control of their owners, as this condition played a key role in assessing the nature of the discovery. Through the documentation process, a common pattern gradually became clear. The evidence did not appear in a manner consistent with an accidental incident or unintentional dropping, as their positions and states were incompatible with the scenario of someone dropping items along the way and then continuing to move normally. This forced those handling the case to consider the possibility that the items had been separated from Elaine and Ruth under involuntary circumstances, or at least in a context beyond the normal control of the two girls. Each new discovery was linked back to the last established timeline marker in the file, to assess when the evidence might have left its owner, before or after the moment Elaine and Ruth vanished from the sight of the final witnesses. This linking was not intended to precisely determine what had happened, but to narrow the time window in which the event leading to the loss of control over the personal items could have occurred, thereby creating a more specific time frame than the previous vague gap. The pieces of evidence were placed in relation to one another, not to infer a complete story, but to evaluate whether they appeared in a consistent pattern, such as uneven distribution along the route or concentration in a particular area, factors that could reflect a sudden interruption in the victim's journey. As the number of confirmed pieces of evidence increased, the recording of the location and condition of each item began to reveal a systematic anomaly, where the discoveries could not be reasonably explained, if based solely on the assumption of a minor incident or a voluntary change of plans. This anomaly did not lie in the individual items themselves, but in how they appeared in space and time, creating a chain of signs indicating that the disappearance of Elaine Hartwell and Ruth Calder was not the result of a random or harmless situation. On that basis, determining that the evidence was not the consequence of an accident became a critical evaluative step, carried out by ruling out the simplest scenarios, such as dropping items while moving or leaving them behind for personal reasons, scenarios that were inconsistent with the known habits and circumstances of the two girls. Each exclusionary conclusion was firmly tied to specific data, from the discovery location to the condition of the item, to ensure that the shift in how the case was viewed was based on logic rather than emotion. When the evidence was placed within the overall context of the file, it began to serve as the first anchor points, helping to narrow the scope of speculation and forcing those handling the case to re-examine the initial assumptions about the disappearance of Elaine and Ruth. Linking the evidence to the final timeline marker was not only to determine when the unusual event might have occurred, but also to assess the degree of control the two victims may have lost during that period, thereby opening the possibility that the disappearance did not occur gradually or randomly, but could have been the result of a specific event taking place within a relatively short time frame. The appearance of the evidence thus marked a significant turning point, as the focus of case handling began to shift from searching for a traceless absence to confronting specific physical signs that the journey of Elaine Hartwell and Ruth Calder had been interrupted in a way that could not be taken lightly. The redirection of the investigation during this phase did not mean answers had been found, but reflected a necessary change in approach, where the evidence became central to evaluating the developments, rather than merely supporting general hypotheses. The phase of discovering the first physical evidence concluded with a clear realization that the disappearance of Elaine and Ruth had left traces, albeit not ones easily recognizable from the outset, and it was precisely these personal items separated from their owners that shattered the assumption of a harmless disappearance, forcing those handling the case to view the entire picture in a more serious light. While the evidence itself remained initial clues, not yet sufficient to explain the entire incident, but enough to affirm that this disappearance could not be regarded as a normal or random event. From the moment the personal belongings of Elaine Hartwell and Ruth Calder were established as signs that the disappearance of the two girls could no longer be viewed as an isolated or harmless incident, the focus of the case gradually shifted away from the initial search areas delineated in the early days. The discovery of the remains did not occur according to a predetermined plan, but emerged during expanded sweeps, at a location outside all the roads, residential areas, and wilderness zones previously considered potentially directly related to the planned route of Elaine and Ruth. The discovery area featured isolated terrain that was difficult to access and unconnected to any routine community activities, making the location itself immediately an anomalous factor requiring special attention. The distance between the discovery site and the area where the two girls were last seen was large enough to rule out the possibility that they had reached it by chance, especially considering the terrain conditions and common means of transportation in 1959. As soon as the initial information was received, the handling focus centered on objectively and accurately documenting the scene to determine whether this discovery had a direct connection to the ongoing missing persons case or was merely an unrelated incident. The initial scene elements, including the relative position of the remains in space, degree of scattering, and surface condition, were recorded without drawing any premature conclusions about the cause or circumstances leading to their presence there. In this phase, establishing a connection to Elaine Hartwell and Ruth Calder became the top priority, as only when that connection was clarified could the nature of the case be accurately reassessed. This identification process was not based on a single indicator, but on the synthesis of multiple factors already present in the missing persons file, including the number of remains matching the two victims, basic characteristics compatible with their age and gender, as well as indirect correlation with the personal belongings discovered in the previous phase. The connection gradually formed not through an immediate official declaration, but through the elimination of other possibilities, as there were no reports of other missing persons cases in the area and corresponding time frame. As this connection became increasingly clear, the perception of the case was forced to undergo a fundamental change, because from that point onward, the file could no longer be handled as an unresolved missing persons case, but had to be considered in the context of a serious incident with fatal consequences. This change in nature was not only of legal significance, but also directly impacted the organization and priorities of the entire handling process, as all prior assumptions about voluntary disappearance or accident were no longer compatible with what had been discovered. The fact that the remains appeared at a location outside the initial search perimeter indicated that the chain of events leading to this outcome had followed a completely different trajectory from the initial assumptions, and that the factors governing the disappearance of Elaine and Ruth went far beyond what could be explained by simple scenarios. From a jurisdictional perspective, the discovery forced the involved units to re-examine the scope of their responsibility, as the discovery site was not within the area where initial resources had been allocated, while also suggesting that the case might involve territories or routes outside the direct management of the original handling units. Expanding investigative authority thus became a necessary step to ensure that all relevant areas could be legally accessed and that appropriate resources could be mobilized to handle a case that had changed in nature. This expansion did not occur formally, but reflected the acknowledgement that the case had entered a new phase, where old assumptions were no longer sufficient to explain what had happened. Concurrent with adjusting authority, scene protection was implemented with a level of strictness unprecedented in previous phases, as for the first time, the case was tied to a specific location of pivotal significance for the entire subsequent process. The scene was sealed off to prevent any unnecessary intrusion, not only to protect existing physical elements, but also to maintain the integrity of the context in which the remains were found. This protection was carried out with the clear understanding that any disturbance, however minor, could erase important information not yet identified at that time. During the discovery phase, all activities at the scene were limited to documentation and preservation, avoiding any actions that could be seen as deep intervention or speculation beyond the function of that moment. The presence of the remains at an isolated location raised a series of new questions, not about whether Elaine and Ruth were still alive, but about how they had been removed from their familiar route and taken to a completely unfamiliar place, as well as the time frame and circumstances in which this displacement had occurred. However, within the framework of the discovery phase, those questions were noted as issues to be addressed in subsequent steps, rather than serving as the basis for unverified hypotheses. The discovery of the remains was thus not merely an outcome of the expanded search process, but a decisive turning point that forced the entire case to be viewed in a completely different light. From this moment, the disappearance of Elaine Hartwell and Ruth Calder was no longer an information gap to be filled, but a chain of serious events that had left clear, tangible, and undeniable consequences. This phase concluded with an irreversible reality. The case had crossed the boundary of an ordinary missing persons file, and all subsequent handling steps would have to be conducted with the caution, scope, and authority commensurate with the true nature of what had been discovered at the scene. From the protected and established remains discovery scene as the new pivotal point of the case, the entire remaining handling process was compelled to shift to the examination phase in accordance with the capabilities and limitations of criminal investigation work in 1959. The autopsy was conducted entirely through manual methods, relying on direct observation, the personal experience of the forensic pathologist, and the still largely mechanical standard procedures of that era, in a context lacking the support of modern analytical techniques. The remains were received in a condition significantly affected by the natural environment, which from the outset limited the amount of information that could be gathered, while forcing those performing the examination to focus on the remaining signs on the bones and any surviving soft tissue to record any abnormalities observable to the naked eye. The examination process was not conducted with the goal of reconstructing the detailed sequence of events, but focused on identifying the clearest signs of external impact, including injuries distinguishable from post-mortem environmental damage. The recording of injuries was carried out cautiously, with each mark described in the medical language of that period based on shape, location, and degree of damage, but it could not go further in precisely determining the timing or implement that caused the injuries. Signs deemed inconsistent with a natural death were noted as factors requiring attention, yet they were not sufficient in themselves to form a decisive conclusion about the circumstances leading to death. Concurrent with recording injuries, clothing and any remaining items on the remains were collected as rare physical samples that could provide additional information, though their analytical value was significantly limited by preservation conditions and the identification techniques available at that time. Each item was documented regarding material, condition, and relative position to the remains, to determine whether they had been disturbed or altered from their original state, but deeper analysis of fibers, biological traces, or microparticles was nearly impossible with the available means. The physical samples were preserved in the hope that they might hold value in the future, even though at that time, the ability to extract information from them was very limited. The technical limitations of 1959 investigative work were clearly evident throughout the examination process, as methods for determining cause of death, time of death, or the presence of external agents relied almost entirely on subjective experience and gross findings rather than high-precision scientific analyses. There was no capability for DNA analysis, no sophisticated chemical testing to detect toxins or trace evidence, and no centralized databases for comparing forensic characteristics, causing all conclusions to be drawn with a high degree of caution, and often stopping at the level of description rather than determination. In that context, accurately determining the cause of death became particularly difficult, as many critical signs may have been erased over time or could not be clearly distinguished from natural post-mortem effects. Those involved in the examination were forced to acknowledge that the conclusions reached only reflected what could be observed at that time, and could not encompass the full sequence of events that occurred before Elaine Hartwell and Ruth Calder died. The inability to identify a suspect during this phase was not the result of procedural shortcomings, but a direct consequence of technical and informational limitations, as there were no clear traces that could link the remains, evidence, or scene to a specific individual. All analytical efforts stopped at confirming that the deaths of the two girls were not the result of natural causes, but were insufficient to indicate who had caused them or how the incident had unfolded. This impotence reflected the reality of criminal investigation work of that era, where many serious cases had to accept large gaps in understanding due to the lack of suitable scientific tools. Nevertheless, the entire examination and analysis process was carefully documented, with the awareness that even this limited information could become the foundation for re-examining the case in the future, when more advanced investigative methods could be applied. The examination phase concluded with an incomplete but sufficient picture to affirm that the case had gone far beyond an ordinary mysterious disappearance, while leaving behind a forensic file bearing the clear imprint of the 1959 period, when investigative science was still in its early developmental stage, and many questions had to be temporarily left unanswered due to the lack of means to resolve them. From the limited but confirmatory conclusions of the examination phase, the entire case file entered a critical juncture, where the involved agencies were compelled to review everything that had been gathered from the night Elaine Hartwell and Ruth Calder disappeared until their remains were discovered and analyzed within the technical framework of 1959. The compilation of all evidence was carried out as a final review step to assess the feasibility of continuing the investigation in an active manner, in which each group of information was reorganized chronologically and by reliability, from initial witness statements, field search results, personal items discovered scattered about, to crime scene records and examination reports. This compilation process did not aim to uncover new details, but to determine whether the existing data was sufficient to sustain a viable investigative direction, particularly in a context where resources had been mobilized for an extended period without yielding a decisive breakthrough. When the evidence was placed side by side systematically, the large gaps in the chain of information became clearer than ever, as no element was strong enough to create a direct link between the deaths of Elaine and Ruth and a specific individual, vehicle, or location beyond the site where the remains were found. The elimination of primary investigative leads occurred as an inevitable consequence of this process, as each hypothesis previously considered central in earlier phases was successively ruled out due to lack of supporting evidence. The possibility that the two girls left voluntarily had been dismissed from the moment the remains were discovered, while the hypothesis of a solitary accident no longer fit with the signs of external impact recorded during the examination. Investigative directions related to individuals who had appeared within the social contact range of Elaine and Ruth also yielded no results, as there was no physical evidence or reliable testimony sufficient to sustain pursuit of those leads in the long term. Efforts to screen routes, nearby areas, and similar reports in the broader region also failed to produce valuable matches, making the likelihood of linking the case to a crime series or specific pattern increasingly faint. In that context, the question was no longer whether the case was serious, but whether there was sufficient legal basis to continue the investigation with the goal of prosecution, and the answer increasingly leaned toward the negative. The lack of sufficient grounds for prosecution was not presented as a sudden decision, but as a conclusion that gradually formed after every reasonable possibility had been considered and eliminated within the limits of available information and technology. With no specific suspect to interrogate, no direct evidence to compare, and no sufficiently clear chain of events to reconstruct the sequence to the standard required for a prosecution file, continuing active investigation became an effort that consumed resources without clear prospects. The decision to suspend active investigation was therefore made as a pragmatic step, reflecting the acknowledgement that the case had reached the limit of what could be achieved under the current circumstances, rather than an abandonment or denial of the importance of the deaths of Elaine Hartwell and Ruth Calder. The suspension did not mean permanently closing the file, but rather a change in processing status, where active search and investigative activities were paused, while all documents, evidence and reports were preserved to serve the possibility of future review. The case file was transferred to cold case classification as a step to formalize this status, marking that although the serious nature of the crime had been confirmed, the necessary conditions to continue the investigative process toward prosecution no longer existed at that time. Cold case classification was not merely administrative in meaning, but also reflected a common reality of that era, when many serious cases had to await advancements in forensic science and investigative techniques to be approached more effectively. The file of Elaine and Ruth was archived with all collected documents, from search area maps, evidence lists, crime scene reports, to examination conclusions, and the final review minutes, all organized to ensure that if the case were reopened in the future, those taking over could understand the entire process that had occurred without having to start from scratch. The suspension and cold case classification phase closed as a heavy chapter in the case, where the absence of answers was not the result of indifference, but the consequence of objective limitations in investigative capabilities of the era, leaving behind an unsolved file, but one preserved with the hope that one day, what was missing could be supplemented, and the truth behind the deaths of Elaine Hartwell and Ruth Calder could be brought to light. From the moment the case file of Elaine Hartwell and Ruth Calder was officially classified as a cold case and archived following the decision to suspend active investigation, many years passed in a state of near inactivity until new conditions emerged that compelled the authorities to reconsider the possibility of approaching the case from a different angle. The reopening of the file did not occur as a reaction to sudden information, but as the result of a systematic re-evaluation process when cold case units conducted reviews of old cases to determine whether any files qualified for re-examination based on advancements in investigative methods and evidence processing compared to the initial time. The file of Elaine Hartwell and Ruth Calder was brought up for review in that context, as despite the many years that had passed, the document structure remained relatively complete, and key physical evidence had never been destroyed or processed for elimination. The procedural reopening of the file initially focused on inventorying all paper documents related to the case, from initial missing persons reports, incident intake records, search diagrams, witness statements, to crime scene reports, examinations, and the suspension decision. Each document was reviewed not only for content, but also for physical integrity, as extended storage time could degrade paper quality, ink, and important notations. Concurrent with the paper document inventory, physical evidence items were re-evaluated within the framework of the preservation conditions they had undergone over the years, including clothing, personal belongings, and samples collected at the scene. The preservation condition of the evidence became a key factor, as their potential value depended heavily on whether they had been damaged, contaminated, or lost during storage. This evaluation was conducted carefully, with the goal of identifying which evidence items still retained sufficient original characteristics to extract information using more modern methods than what had been feasible in 1959. During the inventory process, differences between evidence groups became clear, as some items remained structurally intact, while others had suffered significant effects from time, storage environment, and uneven preservation conditions over decades. Determining viable evidence was not based on expectations of immediately finding a clear clue, but on categorizing what could serve as a foundation for a new approach, especially in the context of analytical techniques that had made leaps forward since the file was suspended. Evidence items previously deemed low information due to initial technical limitations were now re-evaluated from a different perspective, with the central question being whether they might contain traces that had never been identified. The process also included cross-referencing between documents and physical evidence to determine if any inconsistencies in initial recording, preservation, or description could affect current information extraction potential. The inventory was not only technical, but also a step to look back at the entire way the case had been handled, in its historical context, thereby clarifying the limitations that had existed and the new opportunities that could emerge. As evidence was categorized by condition and potential value, focus began shifting toward proposing new approaches, based on combining what remained in the file with more modern investigative methods proven effective in resolving similar cold cases. These proposals were not assertive, but constructed as possibilities to be considered, with each approach tied to a specific evidence group that could be reanalyzed. The reopening of the Elaine Hartwell and Ruth Calder file was therefore not a return to an old case, with the simple expectation that answers would appear on their own, but a systematic re-evaluation process where the value of each document and evidence item was weighed in a new context. The inventory phase closed with a clearer picture of what remained from the case after decades, not to draw immediate conclusions, but to determine whether this file had sufficient foundation to move to a different investigative phase, where the limitations of 1959 were no longer an absolute barrier to seeking the truth. From the inventory results showing that the Elaine Hartwell and Ruth Calder file retained a rare level of integrity for a case from the late 1950s, the case processing entered a strategic phase, where the focus was no longer on reviewing old investigative leads, but shifted to evaluating a core question: whether advancements in modern forensic science could be applied legally, effectively, and responsibly to a file that had existed for over half a century. The evaluation of DNA testing potential was not approached as a default solution, but placed within a cautious analytical framework, starting from the reality that all evidence in the case had been collected and preserved in a context where the concept of preserving genetic material barely existed. Initial evidence was stored with the goal of recording shape and physical condition, not protecting biological traces, making the survival of DNA, after decades, a major question mark. For that reason, before any decision was made, modern forensic experts were consulted to theoretically assess the possibility of recovering DNA from specific evidence items, based on material, environmental exposure level, storage conditions across different periods, and each sample's handling history. This evaluation process did not seek certainty, but to determine whether there existed a reasonable scientific basis, sufficient to justify intervening in evidence that had been sealed for decades. Alongside the scientific factor, legal constraints were considered as a central part of the decision-making process, as unsealing evidence in a cold case was not just a technical issue, but an action that could directly affect the legal value of the entire file if the case proceeded to prosecution steps. The request to unseal was therefore prepared as an independent dossier, in which each evidence item slated for intervention was clearly listed, accompanied by selection rationale, potential value, and possible risks arising during processing. The authorities reviewing this proposal did so, not only based on the potential to yield new information, but also on principles of evidence preservation and the necessity of intervention in the context of a case suspended for a long time. When the decision to permit unsealing was approved, it marked an important transition, confirming that the case had officially entered a reinvestigation phase based on modern scientific foundations, with the condition that all activities strictly adhere to standards aimed at protecting evidence integrity. From there, the selection of suitable biological samples was implemented as a key step, as the number of intervenable evidence items was limited, and each processing carried the risk of degrading or destroying the sample's remaining value. Selection was not based on quantity, but on the likelihood of bearing biological traces directly related to the events leading to the deaths of Elaine and Ruth, as well as the ability to rule out cross-contamination from later handling phases. Evidence items previously assessed as low value in the 1959 context were now reconsidered under entirely different criteria, where the central question was not what they revealed at that time, but what they might still retain that had never been identified. Each proposed sample was accompanied by a detailed risk analysis, in which testing failure risk, contamination potential, and legal consequences, if the sample was damaged, were all weighed alongside potential benefits. On that foundation, establishing an analysis protocol was considered mandatory to ensure that the entire testing process, if implemented, would occur according to a tightly controlled and verifiable chain of actions. This protocol included determining sample handling methods at each stage, from extraction under sterile conditions, transport via clear chain of custody, temporary storage in controlled environments, to analysis at laboratories meeting current forensic standards. Beyond the technical aspect, the protocol also clearly defined responsibilities of each participating unit, methods of recording and storing data, as well as measures to protect results from challenges regarding origin or analytical methods. Building the protocol served not only the goal of seeking new information, but also to ensure that any results obtained, whether positive or negative, could withstand rigorous future scrutiny. Throughout this phase, caution played a central role, as those handling the case were fully aware that applying modern techniques to a cold case was not a magic solution guaranteeing answers, but a limited opportunity, where each decision could create irreversible consequences. The decision to proceed with DNA testing was therefore formed as the result of a multi-layered consideration process, where the hope of seeking truth was placed alongside the responsibility to protect the original file's integrity. This phase closed when a complete analysis plan was approved, in which biological samples were selected, legal conditions were met, and technical protocols were fully established, laying the groundwork for applying modern scientific tools to a case that had been constrained by its era for over half a century, without yet drawing any conclusions about the final outcome. From the approved analysis plan and the carefully selected biological samples from the previous phase, the Elaine Hartwell and Ruth Calder case officially entered entirely new territory, where the limitations of 1959 were overcome for the first time using modern scientific tools. The DNA extraction process from the old samples was carried out with the utmost caution, as the entire handling team was fully aware that these were not biological samples collected under ideal conditions, but rather evidence that had been stored for decades in archives, subjected to various preservation stages, and significantly affected by time. The extraction was not performed en masse, but proceeded step by step, starting with cleaning the sample surfaces to minimize the risk of cross-contamination, before accessing the material believed to contain original biological traces. Every operation was documented in detail, not only for quality control purposes, but also to ensure that the entire process could be reconstructed and verified if necessary. Once the biological material entered the processing stage, modern extraction techniques were applied to recover any remaining DNA molecules, even though they might have been fragmented or significantly degraded over time. Obtaining DNA was not taken for granted, but was the result of combining highly sensitive technology with procedures tailored to the characteristics of aged samples, where every amount of recovered DNA held special value. After extraction, the DNA samples were subjected to analysis using modern technology, including amplification and sequencing methods that allow working with extremely small amounts of DNA, something forensic science in the 1950s could never achieve. The analysis focused on identifying genetic markers clear enough to build a comparable DNA profile, while eliminating noise signals that might stem from prior preservation or handling. Throughout this phase, the samples were processed independently and in parallel with control samples to ensure that any results obtained accurately reflected the biological origin of the sample, rather than being the product of laboratory contamination. As the genetic data began to take shape, a key factor was quickly identified: the presence of male DNA, a discovery of particular significance in the context of a case involving 2 female victims. The identification of male DNA was not treated as an immediate conclusion about the role of a specific individual, but first as an important classification step that guided the entire subsequent analysis process. Experts compared genetic markers to ensure that this DNA was not the result of cross-contamination from legitimate sources such as evidence handlers or individuals involved in prior collection. Excluding legitimate sources was done by cross-referencing with control samples and handling records, confirming that the detected male DNA was highly likely directly related to the events at the time Elaine and Ruth disappeared. Once this possibility was strengthened, the focus shifted to assessing the reliability of the obtained data, an essential step in determining the forensic value of the analysis results. Reliability was evaluated from multiple angles, including the completeness of the DNA profile, the reproducibility of results in independent analysis, and consistency across different samples if available. Experts did not seek a perfect result, but assessed whether the existing data met the threshold to be considered a serious DNA profile, given the original sample's significant exposure to time. Limitations were recorded transparently, as this acknowledgement helped place the results in the proper scientific context and avoid interpretations exceeding the data's capabilities. When evaluations showed that the obtained DNA reached the necessary reliability level, the creation of a suspect DNA profile was implemented as the next decisive step. This profile was not built with the goal of immediately linking it to a specific individual, but to create a set of genetic characteristics that could be used for comparisons in subsequent investigation phases. Profile creation involved standardizing the data, identifying key genetic markers, and storing the information in a format compatible with modern comparison systems, while ensuring the profile could be used in various scenarios, from database matching to genealogical analysis if needed. Throughout the DNA analysis process, a consistent principle was maintained: absolute caution in interpreting results, as all participants recognized that this was the first time the Elaine Hartwell and Ruth Calder case had a specific biological clue, but also a phase prone to excessive expectations. The analysis did not aim to provide a final answer, but to open a new door for the investigation, where scientific data could fill gaps that traditional methods could not. This phase concluded with the completion of a suspect DNA profile with clearly assessed reliability, marking the first time in decades that the case no longer relied solely on speculation and circumstantial evidence, but possessed a specific scientific element capable of guiding subsequent investigation steps, while upholding the principle that any conclusions could only be drawn after placing this data in the broader context of the entire case file. From the moment the suspect DNA profile was completed with clearly determined reliability, the entire focus of the Elaine Hartwell and Ruth Calder case shifted to the data comparison phase, where the true value of the biological analysis began to be tested in the context of modern criminal investigation. Comparing the DNA to databases was not performed as a simple or automated operation, but as a multi-layered process, starting with identifying the scope and type of legally accessible databases, based on the profile's nature and privacy-related legal restrictions on genetic data use. The suspect DNA profile was standardized and entered into comparison systems with available datasets, prioritizing criminal databases built over decades, containing DNA profiles collected from individuals lawfully convicted or arrested. The initial comparison process proceeded cautiously, as experts understood that the chance of a full match in the first round was low, especially for a 1959 case where potential suspects might never have appeared in any system when these databases were formed. When the initial comparisons yielded no direct matches, the DNA data continued to be used to search for lower levels of similarity, aiming to identify the possibility of familial relationships rather than absolute individual matches. This phase marked a significant shift from seeking a specific suspect to narrowing down a group of potentially related individuals based on genetic indicators suggesting family or lineage connections. Narrowing the group was not done arbitrarily, but relied on comparison algorithms designed to assess relationship probabilities, while excluding random matches that might appear in large datasets. Each potential result was evaluated independently, with the goal of determining whether the similarity level was high enough to justify further examination. Alongside identifying potential connections, excluding unsuitable profiles was implemented as a critical step to avoid unnecessary expansion of the investigation. Profiles with low similarity, failing to meet established probability criteria, or incompatible with basic case facts such as age, gender, or geography were removed from consideration. This exclusion not only reduced workload, but also helped protect the investigation's accuracy by focusing resources on directions likely to yield substantive results. As the list of potential profiles gradually narrowed, the focus shifted to placing the genetic results in the context of the case file, assessing whether the identified connections aligned with known details about the timing, location, and circumstances of the events. Genetic profiles showing familial links were examined alongside historical factors, including recorded residences, timeline movements, and possibility of presence in the area when Elaine and Ruth disappeared. This process clearly showed that DNA, despite its high scientific value, could not solve the case on its own, but needed integration into a broader investigative picture to avoid erroneous conclusions. As further comparison rounds continued, a small group of profiles began to emerge as notable intersections between genetic data and contextual factors, not because they provided complete answers, but because they could not be easily excluded like others. Identifying a group of potential suspects at this stage did not mean there was sufficient basis to assign criminal responsibility to anyone, but reflected a shift from an undefined profile to a specific range of individuals warranting deeper traditional investigation. The potential suspect group was identified based on a combination of sufficiently high genetic similarity, suggesting familial ties and compatibility with basic case elements, including estimated age in 1959 and possibility of presence in the relevant area. Each case in this group was treated as a hypothesis needing verification, not a conclusion, and recorded with high caution to prevent over-interpreting the DNA data. Throughout the data comparison phase, a consistent principle was maintained: transparency and verifiability, as every decision to exclude or retain a profile had to be based on clear explainable criteria. This not only protected investigative accuracy, but also ensured that if the case advanced to future proceedings, the DNA comparison process could withstand rigorous legal scrutiny. This phase concluded with the formation of a potential suspect group identified through scientific data and placed within the overall investigative context, marking the first time in decades that the Elaine Hartwell and Ruth Calder case no longer relied solely on vague hypotheses or circumstantial evidence, but had a specific direction guided by genetic data, though final conclusions remained ahead and required verification through subsequent investigation steps. From the narrowed group of potential suspects based on genetic data and contextual factors, the investigation entered a decisive phase, where the goal was no longer to identify the general existence of a connection, but to select a profile prominent enough to become the focus of in-depth investigation. The transition from a group of individuals to a specific person was not done hastily, but based on a multi-layered cross-evaluation between DNA data, personal history, geographic presence potential, and alignment with established facts in the Elaine Hartwell and Ruth Calder case file. During this review, Walter D. Kessler's profile gradually stood out, not due to a single decisive piece of evidence, but because the continuous convergence of multiple factors, when considered together, created a significantly higher level of consistency compared to the remaining individuals on the list. Initially, Kessler was included in the potential group as one of many names with sufficient genetic similarity to avoid exclusion, but through subsequent comparison rounds, other profiles were successively eliminated for failing one or more basic criteria, including age incompatibility with 1959, lack of presence potential in the relevant area, or genetic data showing only very distant and inconsistent links. In contrast, Walter Kessler's profile continued to pass these screening rounds without clear exclusion factors, naturally increasing attention toward this individual as the investigation progressed. Kessler's profile prominence was reinforced when the suspect DNA was compared to available historical information, revealing notable compatibility in terms of timing and generation, sufficient to place him in the age group capable of direct involvement in the 1959 events. The DNA comparison did not aim for absolute identity confirmation at this point, but focused on assessing relative compatibility, where Kessler-related genetic indicators showed higher similarity than other profiles examined. Alongside the biological data, Walter D. Kessler's personal history was systematically re-examined to determine whether key life timelines reasonably intersected with critical case milestones. This review included recorded residences in the late 1950s, occupational or daily activities that might affect mobility, and signs indicating possible presence or travel in the area where Elaine and Ruth disappeared or where their remains were found. These historical data points, considered individually, held no conclusive value, but when related to the DNA data, they began forming a logical chain difficult to ignore. Linking the suspect to the area was not based on assumption, but on realistic access potential, cross-referencing Kessler-associated locations with case area maps and routes. Geographic overlap was not interpreted as confirming behavior, but used to assess probability, the likelihood of an individual appearing at relevant locations at the time of the incident. In Kessler's case, geographic facts created no clear contradictions with the established case scenario, further heightening suspicion compared to others excluded for inability to explain area presence. The suspicion level toward Walter D. Kessler was thus assessed comprehensively, with DNA data guiding but not dominating conclusions, and historical and geographic factors used to strengthen or weaken the hypothesis. Suspicion level was not assigned by simple criteria, but formed by evaluating whether Kessler's profile converged enough factors to justify focusing investigative resources on him. In this context, designating Kessler as the primary suspect did not mean sufficient grounds for charges, but reflected the need to move to deeper investigation, reactivating traditional methods like field verification, additional information gathering, and identity cross-checking. This decision also reflected a fundamental change in the case status, shifting from a cold case with many vague possibilities to one focused on a specific individual, with the most substantiated suspicion level among current options. The primary suspect identification phase concluded with Walter D. Kessler placed at the center of all subsequent investigation steps, not as a final conclusion, but as a key hypothesis requiring independent evidence verification, while the entire file maintained caution, ensuring DNA data and contextual factors served only as guides, not replacements for the comprehensive verification process ahead. From the moment Walter D. Kessler was identified as the primary suspect based on the convergence of genetic data, historical factors, and geographical presence, the investigation shifted to a phase of comprehensive re-examination of this individual using traditional methods, with the goal of verifying whether the indications from the data held up when applied to the real-life circumstances and behavior of a specific person. The review of Kessler's residences and movements was implemented as the first and foundational step, since presence in space and time is the minimum condition for any hypothesis to stand. Archived records of Kessler's places of residence in the late 1950s were collected from various sources, including administrative documents, employment records, and records related to civic obligations, to determine where he had lived, for how long, and whether there were any periods not clearly documented. This process revealed that Kessler's residential history was not entirely fixed, with periods of movement or address changes occurring over relatively short intervals, which made pinpointing his exact location at specific times more complicated. Kessler's routine and non-routine travel routes were also scrutinized, based on the common modes of transportation of that era, to assess whether he could reasonably have accessed the areas related to the Elaine Hartwell and Ruth Calder cases. The review did not seek a specific route leading directly to the crime scenes, but focused on determining whether there were familiar journeys or travel opportunities that placed Kessler in the vicinity of key locations around 1959. Concurrent with the examination of residence and movement, Kessler's historical relationships were re-examined to assess the social context and interactions that might have influenced his behavior during the relevant period. This process involved reviewing family ties, friends, co-workers, and individuals who had regular contact with Kessler, not to directly seek a motive, but to determine whether there were any indirect connections to Elaine Hartwell, Ruth Calder, or the areas they had passed through. The review of historical relationships also aimed to evaluate the stability of Kessler's social life, including whether he had appeared in contexts or groups likely to intersect with the victims, and whether there were significant changes in these relationships coinciding with the time the two girls disappeared. During the review, some relationships were determined to be unrelated and excluded, while others, though not directly linked to the victims, were noted because they could provide information about Kessler's habits, behavior, and timelines in his life. The next step in the re-investigation phase focused on cross-referencing old statements related to Kessler, including what he had said or what had been recorded in various contexts over the decades, not only in the framework of the Elaine and Ruth case, but also in administrative records or other related events. This cross-referencing did not aim to find an overlooked confession, but to assess the consistency of the information Kessler had provided about his residences, activities, and key timelines in his life. Old statements or records were placed side by side in chronological order to determine whether there were contradictions, inconsistencies, or unexplained changes. This process revealed that some details in Kessler's old statements differed when compared across different times, particularly regarding periods where administrative records did not clearly document his location or activities. These contradictions, though not sufficient on their own to prove criminal conduct, were noted as factors requiring explanation, as they undermined the assumption of a seamless and transparent timeline during the relevant period. The identification of key contradictions was not done by exaggerating minor differences, but by focusing on points that could not be easily reconciled across different sources, especially when these contradictions directly related to Kessler's potential presence in the area and time when Elaine Hartwell and Ruth Calder disappeared. Contradictions were considered key when they could not be explained by simple recording errors or memory lapses over time, but suggested the possibility that the information provided did not fully or accurately reflect reality. Throughout the reinvestigation phase, a consistent principle was maintained: caution in interpretation, because focusing on a primary suspect did not allow ignoring the risk of investigative bias. Every finding, from residence data, historical relationships, to contradictions in old statements, was considered within the overall context of the file, to assess whether they truly strengthened the hypothesis of Kessler's involvement, or merely reflected natural gaps in documents spanning decades. The reinvestigation of Walter D. Kessler concluded with the formation of a more detailed picture of his life, habits, and timelines during the critical period, while clarifying points in the historical record that remained unsatisfactorily explained, laying the groundwork for a deeper assessment of Kessler's connection to the Elaine Hartwell and Ruth Calder case, without reaching any final conclusions beyond the scope of this phase. Building on the key contradictions established during the reinvestigation of Walter D. Kessler, the next step in the investigative process was implemented with the highest level of caution, focusing on the indirect collection of comparative DNA to independently verify the suspicion hypothesis without revealing the investigative target or violating current legal limits. Surveillance of the suspect was conducted within permitted bounds, not involving invasive monitoring or direct confrontation, but aimed at observing daily activities likely to naturally leave biological material in public environments. Investigators developed a surveillance schedule based on previously identified movement patterns, selecting spaces where the suspect frequently appeared and where the likelihood of recovering abandoned biological samples was highest, such as public places, transportation means, or non-private daily situations. The surveillance did not aim to create pressure or provoke behavior, but maintained a passive observation state to ensure all collected samples arose naturally, unaffected by the presence of investigative forces. When suitable opportunities arose, the indirect DNA collection process was carried out by seizing objects the suspect had contacted and discarded, provided these objects were not in protected private spaces and collection did not violate personal rights. Each object considered a potential sample source was carefully documented regarding time, location, and circumstances of recovery, to ensure an unbroken chain of custody, and that all subsequent handling steps could be clearly traced. Investigators prioritized objects likely to contain more stable biological traces over time, while considering environmental factors that could affect sample quality, such as temperature, humidity, and cross-contamination risk. Collection did not occur in a single instance, but followed an accumulation strategy, aimed at increasing the probability of obtaining a sufficient quality sample for analysis while reducing reliance on a single source that might degrade or lack data. After the indirect samples were collected, they were sealed and transferred to the analysis laboratory under standard procedures, where comparison with crime scene samples was prepared independently. The comparison process was not conducted immediately, but underwent a preliminary quality assessment to determine whether the recovered biological material was suitable for extraction and analysis, as well as to evaluate potential compatibility with stored crime scene samples. This was to avoid wasting resources and limit the risk of conclusions based on incomplete data. When samples were deemed adequate, comparison was performed by matching key genetic markers, focusing on regions with high discriminatory value and less affected by degradation over time. Analysts conducted comparisons blinded to personal information, meaning they were not provided the suspect's identity, to minimize bias risk in evaluation. Initial comparison results were recorded as probabilities and match levels, rather than immediate affirmative conclusions, to ensure all findings were placed in appropriate statistical and scientific context. When genetic markers from the indirect comparative sample showed significant matching with crime scene samples, the confirmation process was activated with cross-checks and repetitions to rule out errors, cross-contamination, or random coincidence. Samples were reanalyzed independently, sometimes at different facilities, to ensure results did not depend on a single process or equipment. Each analysis was compared to previous results, and only when matching markers were consistently reconfirmed was the result considered to reach reliability threshold. The match confirmation process did not stop at technical comparison but also included evaluating the context of comparative sample collection to ensure the link between the sample and suspect was reasonable and uninterrupted by external factors. When the match level was confirmed, investigators reviewed the entire chain of events from collection to analysis, to ensure no step in the process could be questioned regarding legality or accuracy. This included checking documentation, seals, transport logs, and analysis records, to build a seamless file capable of withstanding any independent scrutiny. Throughout this phase, maintaining information secrecy was considered critical, as any leak could affect the integrity of the investigation and alter suspect behavior. Therefore, information about comparative DNA collection and comparison results was shared only within a very narrow scope, with individuals directly involved in evaluation and decision-making. The comparative DNA collection phase concluded when match results were confirmed at a sufficiently strong level to bolster the suspicion hypothesis, while providing a scientific anchor for subsequent evaluation steps in the investigation, without exceeding the framework of confirming genetic data and reasonable linkage between the suspect and crime scene samples. From the moment the comparative DNA match results were confirmed with high reliability, and the entire collection and analysis process had been fully cross-checked, the investigation entered the critical phase of connecting all disparate data pieces into a logical, consistent chain of evidence capable of withstanding rigorous legal standards. This work did not aim to create a speculative narrative, but to place each verified element, DNA, physical evidence, timelines, and contextual conditions, into a clear relational structure, where each link had independent value while supporting the others. Investigators began by linking the confirmed DNA data to physical evidence seized from the early stages of the case, including personal items of Elaine Hartwell and Ruth Calder discovered during searches, as well as physical samples recovered from the remains discovery site. Each piece of evidence was repositioned in its original discovery context, accompanied by information on geographical location, environmental conditions, and relative timeline to assess whether the presence of biological traces aligned with the reconstructed sequence of events. The linking did not stop at confirming that an individual's DNA appeared on evidence, but focused on the more important question, when and under what circumstances that presence occurred, and whether it was reasonable within the established timelines of the disappearance. Concurrent with linking DNA and physical evidence, the entire case timeline was systematically restructured, based on data collected from the beginning of the investigation to the present phase. Investigators reviewed the last confirmed sightings of Elaine and Ruth, the period they vanished from their planned route, the times evidence was discovered, and when remains were found outside the initial search area. These timelines were placed alongside Walter D. Kessler's clarified residence and movement history from prior phases, to evaluate the degree of overlap between the suspect's potential presence and key events. This process paid particular attention to gray periods where administrative records did not clearly document Kessler's activities or location, as those gaps could play a crucial role in explaining how events unfolded. Once the timeline chain was assembled, investigators moved to completing the overall logical chain, where each finding had to be explained by reasonable causal relationships, not unverified assumptions. This meant continually posing counter-questions to the investigative hypothesis itself, to ensure no link existed merely to serve a predetermined conclusion. Each element, from Elaine and Ruth disappearing from their planned route, to evidence appearing in locations inconsistent with an accident hypothesis, to biological traces matching the suspect, was examined to see whether it could stand independently without needing the others. Only when these elements could not be reasonably explained in isolation was the logical chain considered valid. During the completion of the evidence chain, alternative hypotheses were systematically eliminated, not through blanket denial but by comparing each to verified actual data. Hypotheses raised in the case's early stages, including accident possibility, involvement of unidentified third parties, or random scenarios, were re-examined in light of new findings. Each hypothesis was assessed for whether it could simultaneously explain all known elements, especially the DNA match and evidence linkage. Hypotheses unable to account for biological trace presence or inconsistent with established timelines were gradually eliminated, not by speculation, but by data-based reasoning. This elimination process was carefully documented, as proving that other possibilities had been considered and rejected as crucial to avoid later suspicions of investigative bias. As the logical chain was completed and alternative hypotheses eliminated, the investigative team moved to assessing prosecutorial viability on legal grounds, a step requiring careful consideration between evidence strength and judicial proof standards. This assessment focused not only on whether evidence was scientifically convincing, but also on how it would be presented, interpreted, and challenged in a trial setting. Investigators coordinated with legal experts to examine each evidence chain link from the perspective of a potential defense, to identify points that could be questioned or exploited, to create reasonable doubt. This included evaluating chain of custody continuity, reliability of analysis methods used, and clarity in linking the suspect to specific events. The prosecutorial viability assessment also centered on whether the current evidence chain was sufficient to overcome the reasonable doubt threshold or merely bolstered suspicion. In the context of a decades-old case, investigators were acutely aware that any gap in the logical chain could be magnified during trial, so they cautiously avoided pushing the process beyond what the evidence could support. The outcome of the evidence chain assembly phase was not a final conclusion on guilt, but the determination that available data had reached a level of linkage and consistency sufficient to consider next legal steps, while ensuring all reasonable alternative hypotheses had been evaluated and excluded on objective data grounds. This phase concluded with a tightly structured file, where each piece of evidence had a clear position in the overall logical chain, creating a solid foundation for subsequent decision-making, without exceeding the scope of evidence evaluation and assembly. On the basis of a fully assembled chain of evidence with internal consistency and the ability to exclude alternative hypotheses, the investigative team proceeds to the decisive step of transferring the entire case file to the prosecutor's office for independent legal evaluation, marking the shift in focus from evidence gathering to prosecutorial review. The transfer of the file is not a single administrative act, but a multi-layered preparation process, in which every document, every piece of physical evidence, and every expert conclusion is subjected to a final review to ensure completeness, validity, and verifiability. The file is structured in a logical sequence that reflects the progression of the case, starting with the disappearance event, the search phases, the discovery of evidence and remains, the investigative limitations of the 1959 period, the suspension and transition to cold case status, through to modern DNA findings, data comparisons, suspect identification, and reference sample collection, concluding with the fully developed chain of evidentiary reasoning. The purpose of this structure is to allow prosecutors to approach the case as a seamless progression, avoiding the need to infer or fill gaps with unproven assumptions. Upon receipt of the file, the prosecutor's office conducts a comprehensive legal evaluation, focusing on three main pillars: the legality of the evidence, the strength of the connection between the suspect and the criminal act, and the ability to meet the burden of proof in a trial setting. The legal evaluation examines not only the content of the evidence, but also rigorously checks the collection and preservation procedures, especially for biological samples and evidence decades old, to ensure no violations exist that could undermine its probative value. Prosecutors review the chain of custody, sealing records, transport logs, and analysis reports, cross-referencing them with current regulations to determine whether every step complied with legal standards at the time it was performed. In parallel, they assess how scientific conclusions are interpreted in the file, ensuring that technical terminology and statistical probabilities are presented clearly, without exaggeration or inferences beyond the actual data. During the evaluation, prosecutors also place the file in the context of potential defense counter-arguments, considering points that could be attacked, such as time gaps, sample degradation, cross-contamination risks, or alternative explanations for the presence of DNA. When identifying areas needing further clarification to strengthen the file before reaching the prosecution threshold, the prosecutor's office issues specific supplemental requests to the investigative team. These requests are not aimed at broadening the investigation horizontally, but at reinforcing legal depth, such as requesting additional analysis to confirm the stability of DNA results, clarifying the context of reference sample collection, or adding expert reports to explain gray periods in the suspect's residence and movement history. Each supplemental request is documented in writing, clearly stating the legal purpose and required standard, to ensure that all additional efforts are directed toward enhancing the file's ability to withstand court scrutiny. The investigative team treats these requests as an inevitable part of the process, fulfilling them within the scope of existing evidence and legal regulations, while updating the file in an integrated manner to avoid creating isolated pieces of information. Once the supplemental requests are satisfied, the file is resubmitted for the prosecutors to conduct a final evaluation round, focusing on whether the overall evidence has reached the threshold sufficient for indictment. The indictment approval phase occurs after the prosecutor concludes that the existing chain of evidence not only creates strong suspicion, but also meets the necessary standard of proof to bring the case to trial, with the ability to convince a jury of the connection between the suspect and the criminal act beyond a reasonable doubt. The approval decision is not based on a single factor, but is the result of the convergence of scientific data, logical reasoning, and cautious legal assessment, reflecting the understanding that this is a decade-spanning case with unique challenges regarding evidence and historical memory. When approval is granted, The file officially transitions from investigation to prosecution status, while establishing the legal framework for subsequent steps, in which all actions will be guided by procedural rules and trial standards, concluding the case file submission phase as a milestone marking the shift from investigative truth-seeking to demanding accountability before the law. Immediately after the indictment approval decision is issued, and the file officially enters the prosecution phase, the case processing moves into a particularly sensitive stage, in which every action must be standardized, closely coordinated, and executed in strict legal sequence to ensure the absolute validity of depriving the suspect of liberty. The completion of procedures for issuing the arrest warrant is carried out as an interconnected series of steps, beginning with a final review of necessary legal documents, including the draft indictment, key evidence appendices, and documents confirming the authority of the requesting agency. Prosecutors and investigators jointly participate in this process to ensure that all information presented in the arrest warrant application accurately reflects the file contents, with no errors in names, timelines, locations, or legal basis. Caution is elevated to the highest level, as any technical error in the warrant issuance procedure could lead to serious legal consequences, weakening the entire carefully prepared prosecution process. Once administrative procedures are complete, arrest planning is implemented as an independent phase, not spontaneous, but based on a comprehensive risk assessment related to the suspect, living environment, and external factors. This plan not only determines the timing and location of the arrest, but also analyzes in detail possible scenarios, from full suspect cooperation to situations requiring safety control to avoid risk of injury to involved parties or the surrounding community. Investigators use collected data on the suspect's daily habits, travel schedule, and health condition to select an appropriate approach, prioritizing surprise and rapid situation control to minimize escalation potential. The arrest plan also considers timing, choosing hours when the suspect is least likely to be moving or in contact with others, thereby reducing external interference risks and ensuring the execution occurs within controlled parameters. Concurrently with planning, interagency coordination is implemented to ensure all involved units clearly understand their roles, responsibilities, and action sequence. This coordination is not limited to the primary investigative agency handling the case, but extends to supporting units with jurisdiction in the area where the warrant will be executed, ensuring territorial legality and resource readiness. Coordination meetings are held to unify the implementation plan, with each unit presenting its support capabilities and operational limits, from direct approach teams to outer perimeter security and logistics support. All communication channels are tested and established in advance to ensure information is transmitted quickly and accurately throughout execution, avoiding command overlap or order misunderstandings. In addition, legal aspects related to the suspect's rights during arrest are emphasized in preparations to ensure execution does not violate human rights standards and procedural rules, especially in the context of a decades-old case, likely to attract high public and legal attention. Once units have agreed on the plan and assigned duties, the implementation preparation phase proceeds with focus on specific operational details. Participating investigators and personnel are briefed again on the full plan, including approach routes, standby positions, start signals, and contingency plans for unexpected developments. This preparation also includes checking necessary equipment, from transport vehicles to enforcement tools, ensuring everything is ready and suitable for the mission. Safety factors are prioritized, with clear limits on coercive measures and preference for situation control through presence and legal authority, rather than direct confrontation. Throughout preparation, information about the warrant issuance is kept strictly confidential, limited to essential personnel only, to avoid leaks that could affect execution effectiveness or lead to suspect evasion. This is particularly important given the suspect's long-term stable community residence, where any unusual signs could quickly spread and alter the situation. When all elements, from legal procedures, tactical planning, to interagency coordination, have been completed and final checked, readiness for implementation is established as the endpoint of the warrant issuance phase, marking the transition from preparation to execution, in which all subsequent decisions and steps will occur within the framework of the approved warrant. From the established state of implementation readiness with full plans and specific assignments, the arrest of Walter D. Kessler is carried out in accordance with the approved plan, prioritizing legality, control, and safety to ensure the warrant is fully executed without unforeseen incidents. Participating forces approach the suspect along the designated route, selecting a timing aligned with daily routines to minimize unexpected reactions and avoid unnecessary external factors. The approach is direct yet controlled, with identity confirmation, notification of the legal basis for the arrest, and full compliance with required procedures per regulations. The suspect is placed under control immediately upon the warrant taking effect, thereby ending any possibility of interfering with evidence or affecting case-related factors. During the arrest, executing forces maintain calm and consistency in operations, without exceeding the scope of the issued warrant, to avoid any subsequent legal disputes. Immediately after the suspect is lawfully restrained, supplemental evidence seizure is implemented in the predetermined sequence, focusing on items and documents potentially directly or indirectly related to the previously established evidence chain. Seizure is not a blanket search, but based on a pre-identified list, with each potential item quickly assessed for relevance before sealing. Investigators record in detail the position, condition, and circumstances of seizure for each item, ensuring continuous chain of custody and clear traceability in later proceedings. All supplemental evidence is handled per standard procedures, with classification, sealing, and on-site documentation to avoid cross-contamination or integrity disputes. Evidence seizure in this phase is not aimed at expanding traditional crime scene investigation, but at preserving what could reinforce or clarify the existing evidence chain. In the context of the arrested suspect, no longer able to affect the surroundings. Upon completion of seizure activities, controlled termination of the scene investigation is conducted, marking the closure of the final direct field collection phase related to the suspect. Investigators perform a final sweep of the implementation area to ensure no evidence within the approved scope is overlooked, while confirming all activities are fully documented in the file. Termination of scene investigation does not mean ending all investigative work, but reflects the shift in focus from collection and verification to legal processing within procedural framework. Summary reports are prepared to record the scene activity end time, seized evidence inventory, and sealing status, creating a clear milestone in the case progression. Immediately thereafter, the suspect is transferred per proper procedures to the prosecution phase, with legal rights respected and all required notifications fully performed. The transition to prosecution is implemented as a clear administrative legal step, in which the investigative file is updated to reflect the case's new status from investigation to prosecution, and relevant agencies are notified per authority. In this phase, all information about the arrest and evidence seizure is tightly controlled, regarding disclosure to avoid impacting the integrity of the legal process and ensure subsequent steps occur within the established procedural framework. The arrest of Walter D. Kessler concludes as a meticulously prepared warrant execution, while establishing a clear boundary between the decades-long investigative phase and the formal legal processing phase, where the focus shifts to examining accountability before the law, based on the constructed and preserved evidence chain. Immediately after Walter D. Kessler was lawfully arrested, and all on-scene activities concluded, the case officially entered the initial proceedings phase, where the focus shifted from gathering or verifying new evidence to transforming the results of decades-long investigation into a legal dossier sufficient for court processing. The suspect's detention was carried out in strict accordance with statutory procedures, with steps to establish legal status, detention timelines, and procedural rights conducted rigorously to ensure that all subsequent actions remained within the bounds of the law. The suspect was placed in a detention facility appropriate to the anticipated jurisdiction, where security, surveillance, and management conditions were established to prevent risks of evidence tampering, inappropriate contact with potential witnesses, or the emergence of factors that could affect the proceedings. During the initial detention period, prosecutorial authorities reviewed the entire investigative file transferred from the investigation team, aiming to ensure that all documents, physical evidence, and expert conclusions were fully integrated, consistent, and clearly traceable. This process was not merely formal, but included cross-referencing content across file sections to identify any internal inconsistencies, information gaps, or unresolved points that might impact the strength of the charges. On that basis, the preparation of the indictment was undertaken as a decisive transformational step in which prosecutors systematized the entire chain of evidence into a clear legal structure that fully reflected the case's progression from the initial disappearance through traditional investigation phases, the period of suspension and classification as a cold case, to modern scientific discoveries leading to the identification and arrest of the suspect. Each element in the indictment was directly linked to specific verified evidence, avoiding any speculation beyond the actual data, while ensuring that all conclusions had clear legal and scientific foundations. The completion of the indictment also involved precisely determining the applicable charges, scope of prosecution, and related circumstances, based on legal assessments of the act's nature, the timing of the incident, and current laws governing cases with long historical elements. In this process, prosecutors paid special attention to presenting scientific evidence, particularly DNA data collected and analyzed after decades, to ensure that technical advancements were explained transparently, accessibly, and without risk of being misinterpreted as retrospective speculation. Concurrent with finalizing the indictment content, related legal procedures for approval and filing were conducted in proper order, including submission to the competent authority for review and confirmation that all requirements regarding jurisdiction, statute of limitations, and procedural rights were met. Once approved, the case officially moved to trial-ready status, triggering a series of organizational and strategic trial preparation activities. This preparation included compiling the list of evidence to be presented in court, arranging the order and method of presentation to reflect the established investigative logic, while anticipating potential counter-arguments from the defense. Prosecutors evaluated each piece of evidence from a litigation perspective, identifying strengths to emphasize and points that might be questioned to prepare appropriate explanations, especially given the case involved events from 1959, with limitations on direct witnesses and physical evidence. Trial preparation also involved identifying experts who could be called to explain technical aspects, such as DNA analysis or evidence preservation over decades, to assist the court in understanding the case's scientific context. At the same time, prosecutorial authorities coordinated with relevant units to ensure all logistical, security, and procedural elements were ready when the case went to trial, avoiding unnecessary delays that could affect the parties' rights. Given the case's significant public interest, due to its long cold case nature and use of modern technology to solve it, official disclosures about procedural status were handled controllably and cautiously. Disclosures focused on confirming the suspect's arrest, completion of the indictment, and the case's trial preparation phase, while emphasizing that all conclusions on criminal responsibility would be determined by the court through open litigation. This disclosure aimed to meet public transparency demands without compromising the suspect's right to a fair trial or undermining the legal process's integrity. Throughout the initial proceedings, Authorities maintained consistency in information and actions, ensuring every step was fully documented and strictly adhered to criminal procedure principles. This phase concluded with the suspect in lawful detention, the approved indictment, comprehensive trial preparation underway, and the case officially entering the judicial system's trial space, marking a clear shift from prolonged investigation to legal adjudication. From the moment the case officially entered the trial phase after initial proceedings were completed, the court session opened amid a particularly voluminous file, reflecting an investigation spanning over 6 decades, with multiple phases, methods and standards, requiring the court to approach the matter not only by examining individual evidence, but also by assessing the overall connection between historical data and modern science. The evidence presentation phase followed the structure established in the indictment, beginning with reconstructing the event timeline, from Elaine Hartwell and Ruth Calder's disappearance, initial search and investigation efforts, physical evidence and remains discoveries, to the suspension period and cold case classification, before reactivation through scientific advances. Each evidence group was presented in logical order, not to create emotional impact, but to clarify probative value and role in the overall argument, from physical evidence preserved over decades, historical investigative documents, to recent scientific analysis results. The presentation emphasized how seemingly disparate elements were reconnected, showing why data collected at different times could form a consistent evidence chain when placed in the same analytical framework. Throughout, the court closely monitored evidence admission, asking questions to clarify origin context, collection methods, and limitations of each type, particularly distinguishing original data from derived conclusions. Moving to the legal argument phase, parties presented views on evidence evaluation and interpretation, with prosecution defending the continuity, legality, and scientific validity of the entire investigation, while defense sought points creating reasonable doubt. Arguments centered on key issues, including validity of using modern scientific techniques on 1959 evidence, potential degradation or alteration over time, and handling historical gaps in case reconstruction. Prosecution argued that early investigation limitations did not diminish evidence value but, when combined with modern methods, illuminated previously inaccessible elements, while defense contended that time length and technical standard changes could weaken conclusion certainty. Argument focus gradually shifted to DNA evidence evaluation, seen as pivotal in linking the suspect to the scene, as this scientific evidence carried great weight but required careful explanation. The court demanded clarification of the entire DNA extraction, analysis, and comparison process, from sample selection, cross-contamination controls, to statistical reliability determination, to ensure conclusions were technically accurate and properly interpreted legally. Parties debated DNA match significance, whether it proved only biological presence or could be causally linked to events, and combining DNA with other physical evidence and timelines for a complete argument chain. The court examined not only scientific match but also trace origin context, questioning reasonable presence timing and alternative explanations, to determine if DNA truly supported the prosecution hypothesis. Experts were cited to explain technical aspects in clear yet precise language, helping the court and parties grasp method limits and strengths. As arguments concluded, the court moved to overall evaluation, placing each evidence back into the big picture to assess interconnection and mutual support. Evaluation relied not on single factors but convergence of verified data, with each link assessed for reliability, relevance, and resilience to counter-arguments. The court considered whether the evidence chain was strong enough to overcome reasonable doubt, while addressing unavoidable limitations of a decades-long case and how they were handled under current law. The trial phase ended when the court completed deliberation and issued conclusions based on all presented evidence and legal arguments, marking the end of litigation and opening the next legal transition, where consequences would be established by the court's judgment. From the end of litigation, When all evidence and legal arguments were fully presented to the court, the session moved to the verdict phase, focusing on sentencing and establishing criminal responsibility based on criminal law proof standards. The court announced the verdict after comprehensively considering the file, placing each evidence group in interconnected context, from historical disappearance data, physical evidence and remains discoveries, to modern scientific results, and the consistent logic chain established in investigation and trial. Sentencing was not merely reading a final decision, but the culmination of prolonged evaluation, where the court clarified the verdict rested on convergence of reliable evidence, not speculation or pressure from the case's unique cold case nature. In the verdict content, Walter D. Kessler's criminal responsibility was established based on direct links between the suspect and key case elements, including independently verified DNA match, timeline and presence compatibility, and reasonable exclusion of alternatives considered throughout proceedings. The court emphasized responsibility was not inferred from single evidence, but from mutual support, creating a complete proof structure surpassing reasonable doubt. Establishing responsibility also involved clearly delineating crime scope and nature in specific historical context, acknowledging 1959 investigation limitations but affirming they did not negate modern findings' probative value when applied to legal standards. In sentencing, the court clarified the decision aimed not to correct the past or compensate for lost time, but to administer justice under current law, based on objectively and legally provable facts. The sentencing portion noted the case spanned decades with significant changes in investigative methods and scientific standards, and modern techniques were deemed appropriate when used to illuminate truth, not arbitrarily reinterpret history. After announcement, the main trial phase officially closed, marking litigation end and clear boundary between investigation, trial, and legal consequences. Closing did not merely procedural but confirmed full judicial review, with all parties having opportunity to present and rebut per rights and obligations. The court noted that in a decades-long case, reaching final verdict required patience, caution, and strict adherence to rule of law principles, ensuring justice in both outcome and process. In the verdict's final part, case significance was noted at multiple levels, not emotionally, but as assessment of legal and systemic impact in resolving a historical cold case. The court acknowledged the case reflected unique challenges of handling incidents in limited technical contexts, while showing science's role in supporting justice when applied cautiously and controlled. Significance lay not only in individual responsibility, but in affirming time passage does not erase legal system's duty to address serious crimes when evidence permits. The verdict closed the trial phase by confirming legal standards met, procedural rights respected, and final decision based on comprehensive evaluation, setting stage for post-trial phase under law, without extending to further developments beyond this verdict. From the moment the verdict was announced and criminal responsibility established under law, the case officially entered its final phase of closure, a process of summarization, systematization, and confirmation that the entire investigation proceedings had reached lawful and complete conclusion. Summarizing the investigative process involved comprehensive review, where authorities re-examined the full case journey from the 1959 initial disappearance, early search and investigation activities, technical limits causing stalemate, suspension and cold case classification, to file reactivation, modern technique application, and ultimately prosecution, trial and verdict. Summarization did not reinterpret or add details, but confirmed each phase was properly authorized, procedurally correct, and logically connected, ensuring no part was overlooked or inadequately handled in the official file. On that basis, investigators and prosecutorial authorities jointly identified clarified elements, including reconstructing core events of Elaine Hartwell and Ruth Calder's disappearance, determining criminal nature, clarifying suspect scene link through scientific and physical evidence chain, and affirming technical advances' role in breaking decades-long impasse. Clarified elements were presented not as celebratory summary, but as catalog of proven, court-confirmed conclusions, distinguishing legally proven facts from non-debatable issues. Simultaneously, this phase transparently noted case limitations, acknowledging that despite final verdict, some aspects remained unfully clarified due to time passage, initial physical evidence loss, or absent direct witnesses. Noting limitations did not weaken results, but honestly reflected historical case reality, where justice works with remnants and decides on proof standards, not absolute perfection. Limitations were recorded as case context, including unfillable information gaps, considered but unverifiable hypotheses, and objectively unverifiable historical elements. This ensured academically and legally honest closure, avoiding impression all questions answered, when reality did not allow. After summarization, the case file was finally systematized, with classification, arrangement, and archival of all documents, evidence, and legal decisions per judicial storage regulations. This included confirming evidence final status per verdict, full sealing and documentation, and database updates reflecting closed status. Closure was not merely administrative, but official confirmation. The case completed all processing phases under legal system, with no ongoing investigation or proceedings. In the closed file, case status was clearly noted, with key timelines, final court decision, and necessary notes for future legal or expert reference. Closure also marked end of active investigative responsibility, shifting from processing to resolved, with all legal consequences established. Systemically, closure affirmed that cold case processing, though prolonged and complex, can conclude when evidence, technique, and legal conditions converge, while showing how justice records and closes cases without losing process integrity. This phase ended with the Elaine Hartwell and Ruth Calder file officially marked closed, reflecting complete investigation proceedings from missing persons opening to final verdict, confirming all steps lawful, clearly distinguishing clarified elements from insurmountable limits, completing the case's legal life cycle without opening further developments beyond the closed file. The story of Elaine Hartwell 18 and Ruth Calder 20 began like so many American tragedies. Two young women left a gathering, one evening in 1959, took a familiar route, and vanished without a word. Families reported to police. Search teams scoured roads, neighborhoods, and wilderness, but no trace, until personal items turned up scattered, and later remains were found outside the initial search area. The most terrifying part was not just the crime, but how the 1959 era deadlocked the case. Manual forensics seized samples, but technical limits meant no suspect, forcing the file into cold case status. The lesson for American life today is that personal safety and legal truth both need systems. On a personal level, treat going home as a process, share starting point and planned route, set check-in points, texts, calls, agree on rules to report immediately if overdue. The file's established last known timeline helped later investigation with a comparison frame. You can create your own timeline by habitually sharing location with trusted people when out at night or on quiet roads. At the community level, the story shows the value of evidence preservation, clothing, samples, chain of custody. Things seemingly useless in 1959 became the key when DNA was extracted and matched. Then indirect DNA collection confirmed the scene sample match, ultimately building the evidence chain leading to prosecuting Walter D. Kessler. So support policies tackling backlog and standardizing evidence storage, while trusting early reporting and remembering details, license plates, routes, times. Justice sometimes arrives very late, but it comes faster when individuals and communities live with discipline, processes, and never dismiss unusual signs from the start. If you believe stories like Elaine Hartwell and Ruth Calder's need retelling to remind us never to forget, please subscribe to the channel to follow the journey, uncovering truth behind cold cases that seemed forever asleep. Thank you for staying until the end, and see you in the next video, where another file will open to remind us that justice may come late, but it should never be abandoned.